So I'm here in Chattahoochee, sure I'm mispronouncing it, Chattahoochee Native American name forest in Georgia, which borders Tennessee. And on the way here, you'll see lots of churches, lots of billboards. And the primary message on those billboards will be religious, particularly with respect to Jesus Christ, and it will be pro-military. And it's tempting to mock the slogans, many of which say the same thing: God bless America, redeem yourself in Christ, etc. That would be too simplistic. It wouldn't explain why this state and much of the South is friendlier and more peaceful, in a sense, compared to a lot of other places in America that don't have a similar ethos, like, say, Chicago or New York. And let's talk about that a little bit. First of all, you can't separate the economy in the South from military spending. You just can't do it. So a lot of what you're looking at when the church decides to post something blessing veterans is because the congregation probably has people in it that are being paid by the United States military. It probably has quite a few people because there's no economy here that can be divorced from military spending. The economy in the South used to be based on slavery and therefore agriculture. And it still is to some extent. The popular on the flag of Georgia, I believe, or at least it's on the state motto, it's a peach, a fruit. And of course, when the South lost the Civil War, it's quite easy to see how they still were able to keep and maintain the land in the hands of a few people, which is why you see so many plantation houses here in Georgia and all over the South. A lot of land, not much, in the way of the type of tracts you would see in suburban East Coast or West Coast. Certainly not the kind of high-rises you would see on the East Coast, like in New York, or on the West Coast in San Francisco. So what you have here is a flat sort of situation where people can join arms together and believe in the same things. Because in one sense, they've all lost a war, and they've all lost a war in the sense that they've also lost an economy as a result of that war. You can call it creative destruction if it weren't such a bloody historical situation. And so when you talk about to people here, you'll notice a couple things. Number one, when you're in the military, you typically fight for God and country. You don't just fight for the country because countries change, politicians change, flags change. And so you want to have something infinite attached to the loyalty. It's good for the state because it's free, in a sense. You give a tax exemption, and then you pay people who are members of the congregation to serve and to be employed. And at that point, you've got loyalty that is, in a sense, not bought and paid for. That's simplistic. Fraternities, you can say the same thing about them, right? Do they buy and pay, members? And if that's all it was, it wouldn't replicate, or it would replicate the same relationship between a corporation and an employee, and it doesn't. The reason it doesn't is because, on one level, you're appealing to something higher than yourself that is attached to a value or values of infinite duration. That's the key. And that's also why people here are so friendly, because they all have something in common, even though from a factual perspective, an objective basis, they're all quite different. Even if they believe in Jesus Christ, somebody might be Catholic, and then you've got so many different congregations, evangelical and so on, Southern Baptist, and they probably don't believe in the same things. Remember, the Protestants were protesting the Catholic Church. And in Germany, and that was after the Catholic Church set up the new Holy Roman Empire nearby what is now Saxony in Germany. And the reason none of the founders of this country are Catholics is because the non-Catholics were fleeing essentially corruption and persecution. It was really more corruption. And when they came here, you of course had more splinters. Somebody might not have agreed with the racial policies. Somebody might have still believed in segregation. And so you probably had a split at some point between the Baptists and then the Southern Baptists. You probably had a lot of splits on the issue of civil rights. And in between all this, since we're in Georgia, you had Jimmy Carter, whose father was a peanut farmer. And his mother was not an abolitionist, but close to it. But his father favored segregation, from what I understand. So Jimmy Carter grows up in this conflicted area, but he still comes from a family where, in an area where somehow it's not segregated. Part of that might be because the land is owned by so few people that the quote-unquote poor people have to end up together somewhere. And if so much land is owned by a few people, the minorities are going to be of all colors. And that may have been what happened with Jimmy Carter, who had a lot of black friends. So when Jimmy Carter grew up, he managed to appeal to the white Southerner simply because of who he was. He's called a man of the soil, an honorable man. He was in the military as well. Again, it's a consistent theme in the South. You want to get out of your small town, where do you go? You have to join the military. Or you can be a peanut farmer and stay right where you were born. That's the choice you have. So the churches play an intermediary role in this non-diverse economy. That in the past, again, was just agriculture or military. Those were probably your options. There was no technology, there was no automobiles, certainly not on the same level. No space programs, no space force, and so on. And so Jimmy Carter grows up in this environment, and in a sense, somewhat similar to the current president, Joseph Biden, who was a lifeguard at a primarily African-American pool. So Joseph Biden, one of the reasons that he is, he's relatable to many people, is because of his experience growing up with the African-American community. So you certainly can see him, going to somebody's house that's not of the same skin color and so on and so forth. That's not Catholic, for example. So you see, again, a theme throughout history where the working class has, in a sense, been not segregated, but not necessarily segregated growing up, especially not, post-1965, post-desegregation. It's quite obvious, it's quite true that, of course, there were cities in the deep South that prevented desegregation within their schools, that shut down schools, opened up a lot of private schools. There certainly were those cities. But of course, there also had to be a lot of schools that did voluntarily comply, or at least reluctantly, but they still did it. And so from this, again, common theme of a non-diversified economy, along with segregation, along with a movement to end segregation legally, you've got Jimmy Carter, and in a sense, you've got Joseph Biden. You've got a theme that runs throughout white history as attempting to become open-minded by studying people who are not like you. And when you believe in something similar, in other words, even if you're Catholic, even if you're, in answer to the Pope, in other words, the Catholic Church believes that the individual cannot interpret the Bible. It's the Pope who does that for you. And the Protestants do not believe that. The Protestants and all the other splinter groups believe that you can have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, represented by the Trinity, in which one of Christ's formation is a man, just like you and me. That's not consistent across the board. I believe the Jehovah's Witnesses do not believe that Christ was ever a man. In other words, I don't necessarily believe in the Trinity. But even if you have those differences, substantial differences, you're still able to say to your neighbor, especially in the old days, you believe in Christ and I believe in Christ, we have something in common, because there's not much else that you have in common except perhaps being part of an area that lost a war. And when you lose a war, it also forces you to be a little bit more humble because of the lack of economic opportunities. When you lose a war, your economy is dependent on somebody else. It's dependent on foreign direct investment, except in this case, it was domestic direct investment, whether it was in reconstruction or something else. And you can see how the militaries would swoop in and become entrenched when you put all those things together, you have a comfort level that is not possible without some sort of homogeneous belief. And so that's the first thing to realize, is that when you talk to people here, they have a comfort zone because they're comfortable with themselves and their neighbors because they have something in common. And that transcends race, but not religion. And you look at the billboards. Why are the billboards so odd? They're not economic in nature. Part of that is because whoever is putting signs on the advertising is attempting to signal what the values are of that community. And if there is somebody, an outsider who comes in that opposes the community, then what you're going to have is suddenly those billboards won't be talking about religion anymore. They'll be talking about that person who's coming in and trying to change things in a way that is not favorable to the local population. And so you see that in Europe. In Hungary, you saw billboards that that were like anti-George Soros, that were anti-foreign direct investment. And I'm sure that, they've probably changed by now, and they weren't the same before that direct investment was part of the landscape. So what you're really doing is you're preserving the political character, which is also linked to, oh wow, I'm looking at a caterpillar that's beautiful. Uh-oh, I think I might have scared it off. Let me see if I can show you. It's very hard. Can you see it? I'm trying to show you. I'm really hard. Yep, poor thing. It is beautiful. I'll try to take a photo of it. So you shouldn't mock people anywhere. Because the commonality here in the South is that they're maintaining the political structure because you're all victims of a lost war. That's what the advertising really is signaling and trying to maintain the, I suppose, homogeneous nature, whether it's politics, through gerrymandering, or something else. With respect to being kind to each other and agreeing to disagree and still get along with their neighbors, again, because you have that commonality in place, people are comfortable with themselves and their neighbors. The downside, of course, is that if you really look at the Abrahamic religions, you probably want to study them in context, right? Christianity was in part a reaction to Judaism, which might have been more elite than was viable. Then you have Islam, which became more strict because Christianity might have been in a sense, too liberal and too loosey-goosey. And so you really do want to study the whole thing in context, and that's not going to be possible if you all believe in the same thing, especially in a religious movement that preceded a successor movement. That again was probably in reaction, especially if you look at it from an economic perspective with the prohibition on interest, as opposed to, say, Jubilee within the Christian tradition. And so you will notice when you come here, good people. Right? People of the soil, people of the earth. That's what they're talking about here in Georgia. And the reason they have that in common is counterintuitive. They're able to be that comfortable with themselves and other people because they're homogenous. And if you believe in diversity like I do, you are not opposed to any of this, obviously. It's not my place to be opposed to anything, really. But you can also see how it limits you intellectually. And that didn't affect certainly the South in terms of writing, in terms of philosophers, in terms of all that. And that really probably does come from losing a war. But in terms of having a global outlook, you can see how the military helps avoid insularity. And in doing so, what brings back to the church stories that would otherwise be unavailable to someone like, say, a peanut farmer. So overall, when you look at all these different things, you look at a landscape of great beauty and of great harmony. It's really based on having something in common. When I say I favor diversity, what I'm really saying, and I'm really lamenting the fact that the government in this country has ceded social welfare and ideological welfare to religion, to nonprofits that are religious in nature. And as a result, become devalued itself. So you can imagine, for example, an Eisenhower, just simply speaking on behalf of the nation, imparting Christian values, which are really religious values, without ever mentioning the fact that his mother was a Jehovah's Witness. And that used to be the case. The more you have to advertise something, there's a sense, a common sense or an intuition that you don't have as much of it as you think you have. But really, it's a form of advertising and marketing to make up for the fact that you don't necessarily have that substantively or intuitively or inherently, which is why you have to advertise it. It's not necessarily the case. In some cases, you can advertise something to show people what you have, what's different about something, so that you can attract them to your product or your service or your belief system. But there's a sense that excessive advertising is covering something up. But at least here, it's not covering something up that's sinister. It's simply covering up a comfort level that derives from having something in common for the majority of the population. And you can see how that would be resistant to some sort of change ideologically. You can see how that would render people not closed-minded, but more susceptible to false data, false information about other cultures. And that's really one of the reasons that this country is suffering ideologically, because what you have is a landscape that's homogenous in a way that renders the population a national security risk in terms of understanding other cultures. And there's a sense that you can understand all the cultures in the world, but you would have to lose a part of yourself, a piece of yourself, to do something like that. And so you can also see that, what William Butler Yeats talked about, the best in the world lack conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And you can see some of that. You can see the ground for some of that, the landscape for some of that, happening all over the South, at least in the past, before they lost the war. But again, you have to see the good and the bad. And you have to be able to see that the comfort level here, the kindness, is based on sharing something that is infinite, or at least a belief system that is infinite and that allows people to come together. But, of course, because you're covering up, in a sense, the conflicts between the Catholics and the Protestants, you are, in a sense, rewriting history in a way that's not necessarily accurate. And that prevents, in a sense, a self-examination as well as just of history, as well as just trying to teach people what history in this country is really, really, really about, which includes a lot of European conflict and a lot of people who escaped European conflict to come here and create a safe haven. And we have that in a sense, but I don't think we understand that from a religious perspective, because there was a lot of religious conflict that resulted in people coming here. And we've sort of covered that up a little bit. And we focus on race, which is one component. And in order to really sort of figure out the history of this country, you also have to study religious conflict as well, particularly between the Catholic Church and the offshoot splinter movements within the Protestant movement. And then you probably have to come into the Civil Rights Movement, which caused, I'm presuming, a split in the Baptist, Southern Baptist versus Baptist. A comment was made about Medgar Evers being a very devout Baptist. And that today would probably mean a Southern Baptist rather than a regular Baptist or an evangelical. So anyway, we've heard a beautiful waterfall called Keown Falls. And it's right behind me.